Okay. Okay, so we are now up. We are History of Jerusalem, Season 2, Episode 3. So I'm going to share my screen. I just, one quick technology test. I want to make sure that you're seeing, want to hit play. I want to make sure you're seeing, are you seeing two slides or one?
Two.
Two.
Okay. I keep making that mistake. So let's do this. All right. And then, all right. Are you seeing two slides or one now?
One.
Okay, perfect. Okay, we're all set up in the right way. So, okay, History of Jerusalem, Season 2, Episode 3. And the subtitle for tonight's episode is When the Crescent Eclipsed the Cross. Now, the crescent is, of course, the symbol of the Muslims. But we have a little while to go before we actually get to that point. Just for the sake of the recording and the audio quality, I'm going to mute everyone. If you have a question, though, please feel free to unmute yourself and interject the question whenever it comes to you. So we're going to start off with the Byzantine and Roman wars. So the Byzantine Empire is, by other names, it's the Eastern Roman Empire. So the Eastern Roman Empire is essentially seated in Constantinople, right there in Turkey. The Bosphorus is this sort of very interesting land junction that holds, sort of encapsulates the Black Sea. It's sort of the bridge between Europe and Asia, and that's where the Byzantine Empire is at that point. The Persian Empire, of course, is in Baghdad, or it's seated maybe 30 kilometers in a city that I essentially won't be able to pronounce, but that's where the Persians are. And for 400 years, the Persians and the Byzantines go to war. And what you're looking at right now, by the way, is a Persian representation of a surrender of the Romans. Here is another Byzantine recollection. It's a mural again of the Persian king being greeted by the Romans who are submissive. This is the Arch of Severus Septimus, not to be confused with a character in the Harry Potter series, but rather a Roman general. And this is his picture of his victory over the Persians. But what is the important thing for us in terms of Jerusalem? Over 400 years of wars, the Persians reached Antioch, that is the Byzantine capital, 4 times. And the Romans reached, and this is the city I can't pronounce, Ctesiphon, that's the Persian capital. It's 35 kilometers south of present-day Baghdad, 3 times. So they traded, they seesawed between each other. These are the two great powers of the Middle East. And essentially what we're going to see is they beat each other up enough that they allowed a third party, a third power in the region, spoiler alert, it's not the Jews, to essentially assert power in the Middle East. But here's where the Persian Empire is in the Sassanid dynasty, just to give you a sense of the map. This is, over here is Constantinople, that's the Byzantine Empire, and essentially the Euphrates River right over here is more or less the border, often, between their conflicts. And they are each trying to gain vassal states in different places. This all gets interesting for us. So just reminding everybody where we've been. So after when we last left our heroes, when we last left Jerusalem at the end of the last episode, Theodosius is the Roman emperor, and he is very passionately Christian. He essentially defangs, or I should say, decapacitates the Jewish legal entity. According to one version that I found in Simon Sebag Montefiore's Give me 1 second. I have to let 2 people in. Why is it not showing? There we go. In Simon Sebag Montefiore's biography of Jerusalem, he says that Theodosius executed the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin. According to most of the historical accounts that we have, though, excuse me 1 second, I have to stop the share because something's wrong with Zoom. Okay, we'll start it up again. Just had to omit a few people. Okay, here we go. Jumping back. So, as I was saying, Theodosius deposes the Sanhedrin in 425. That's the end of Jewish rule. And so at this point in our story, the Christians are ruling Israel. They are ruling Jerusalem. Jews are not allowed to go into Jerusalem. Jews are not allowed to pray in Jerusalem. They are allowed in only on Tisha B'Av. And then during Tisha B'Av, if they want to stay and pray for a few more minutes, they have to toss a few coins to the Roman guards. All of this is going to change in and around the years 612, 613. And the figure that brings about the change, it's just like you can't make this stuff up. Anybody who wants to fund a movie, we could probably do a pretty good one on the wild boar, Sharbaraz, the wild boar of Persia, who conquers Jerusalem. Now, he conquers Jerusalem with help from the Jews. The Jews are only too willing to help the Persians reconquer Jerusalem. What happens is you have some very interesting characters on the Jewish side. Remember that the Christians had been oppressing the Jews now for hundreds of years. They hadn't let them into Jerusalem. All of that is how Jews felt. Jews were persecuted, sometimes even forcibly converted. And there are interesting figures that are going to help out the Byzantines. Not the Byzantines. They're going to help out the Persians to vanquish the Byzantines. And the most interesting of them is this very wily, very creative military general known as the Wild Boar, Sharbaraz, which literally means the wild boar of Persia. And you see him, by the way, on this coin. Depicted on the coin. This is a little rendition of his attack of Jerusalem. But let's talk about the people who helped him out. So one of the people who helped him out is this Jew who we know relatively little about. His name is Benjamin of Tavaria, and he essentially he's very wealthy, and he hires his own mercenary army that is going to travel with, and they're going to help navigate the roads. They're going to be the sort of the fifth column from behind Christian lines, who help the Persians essentially in this victory over Jerusalem itself. When they get to Jerusalem, first they go to Caesarea. You can see here is the map of the direction in which they took to Jerusalem. They come in just crossing at Tavaria. That's where they pick up the extra forces that were hired by this Benjamin of Tavaria. And you can see that they are going down to Sepphoris is what we now call Tzipori, and then ultimately they end up in Caesarea, and that is a very heavily fortified Roman Christian city, and from there they can make their way down reasonably easily to Jerusalem. When they get to Jerusalem, they lay siege to the city. And the siege back then is brutal. The first thing they do is they burn all of the churches outside of the city. Now, we should be aware of the fact that each side traded lumps with the other. If we remember back to our last episode when we were dealing with the Christian emperor Theodosius, and that what he had done was the Christians were burning down synagogues, and then they deposed the head of the Sanhedrin because he tried to rebuild the synagogue. So Christians had been burning synagogues for a long time. The Jews finally say, hey, you know what? All's fair in love and war. Guess what? Now we've got the Persians on our side. You've got churches outside the city. We've got fire, we've got tinder, and guess what's going to happen to these churches? And so they burned down the churches outside the city. They also breached the walls of the city. They breached the tunnel under Herod's gate. And the way that they do this is they dig it out. They set up supporting timbers. Then you burn down the timbers. When the timbers fail, the wall crumbles underneath, and you can send your forces in. And there are 3 days of looting, in burning of churches on the inside of the walls of Jerusalem, including, and I think this is important and significant, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I'm not an expert in Christianity, but it is my understanding that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the holiest site of Christians in the city of Jerusalem. And so that is a very, very significant event. There are some fascinating figures on the Jewish side. This particular individual, Nehemiah ben Chusiel ben Ephraim ben Yosef. So, first of all, very generally speaking, when you see people identified in Jewish history, they're usually something ben something. Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? Yochanan, the son of Zakkai. You have Shimon bar Kochba, right? So Shimon, son of Kochba, or Shimon bar Yochai, so Shimon, son of Yochai. These are typical names. You very rarely get people who are referenced commonly back 3 and 4 generations. The key part of this reference here, though, is the name Yosef, this part of it. The reason it is interesting is because he was reported to be the Messiah, son of Joseph. There is a tradition that there are 2 Messiahs. There's the Messiah, the son of David. He's going to be the king. When people talk about Mashiach, that's Mashiach ben Yosef, ben David, right? That's when we talk about Mashiach, general Mashiach without any qualifiers. That's Mashiach ben David. That's the king that's going to sit on the throne in Jerusalem. Mashiach ben Yosef, he's a different character. He is going to be the Mashiach who fights the wars of the Jewish people and eliminates our enemies, so that the Mashiach ben David will be able to ascend the throne. Interestingly, there are many figures in history who have been called Mashiach ben Yosef. Anybody know in modern times who was the last person to get that moniker, as far as I know? Given so by none other than Rabbi, the original Rabbi Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook. The answer is Theodor Herzl. There's a very famous speech by Herzl called Hesped B'Yerushalayim, a eulogy in Jerusalem, in which he compares. He doesn't use Herzl's name because that might be a little bit too fiery for a religious man to mention such a secular Zionist. But he very much admires Herzl, and so he delivers a eulogy on the day that he dies, comparing him to this kind of figure, Mashiach ben Yosef. The point of such a figure is that figure is one who leads the Jewish people politically or militarily to a position of relative strength. And this individual, Nehemiah ben Chusiel ben Ephraim ben Yosef, he leads a rebellion against the Roman emperor Heraclius, and he's thought of as this Mashiach ben Yosef. And he may even have restored for a short period of time the sacrifices, the karbanot in the Beit HaMikdash. That's a fascinating figure. I mean, we have very, very little evidence about who he was because there's very little that is actually preserved from that time, and the sources are scant. But the existence of such a figure in and of itself is very, very interesting. And part of why we know so little about them is because this is really a flash in the pan. It sort of seems like, okay, they're ready to build the 3rd Beit HaMikdash. But before they know it, the winds are going to change. But in this very little bubble, in this flash in the pan, the next thing that happens is that the Persians think that maybe they've initially allied themselves with the Jews, and they are looking to shore up their victory. And since the Christians were their enemies, what they do is they deport 37,000 Christians to Babylon, to essentially Baghdad, and they go with fragments of the true cross. This is part of their narrative, right? That in the same way that we might have taken certain holy things with us when Jerusalem was destroyed for us, so their holiest object there are the fragments, the wood of the cross. If you remember, we talked maybe even a month ago about the fact that at this period of time, Christian relics are a very big thing in Jerusalem, that the Constantine's mother is obsessed with the idea of the true cross. There's this narrative that the Jews are in concert with the devil and they hid the true cross, and this is part of what they're taking with them from Jerusalem in their exile, now imposed by the Persians upon the Christians. Interestingly also, other Christians were collected in the Mamila pool, right? Everybody knows them. Hopefully everybody knows the Mamila Mall in Jerusalem. So right there was a pool, and in that pool, they gathered them all together. That might be the Sultan's pool. And they asked them to give up their religion. So the Christian sources say, no, our Christians were too pure for that. No one gave up their religion. The general theme, by the way, of this time period is if you put people to the sword, you oppress them, and you try and get them to convert, it's really a bad idea. It doesn't really work. However, here's where the flash in the pan ends. So in 617, the Persians once again expelled the Jews from Jerusalem. And you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, did we not hire lots of people to help you guys retake Jerusalem? Did we not help you retake Caesarea? Were we not your fifth column? Did we not help you get rid of the Christians? Right? What happened? And so the answer is really this, that the Jewish population was 10 to 15% of the entire country. And they just weren't a large enough presence to be the active governing partners. It was just an imbalance. And so also, Jews had a reputation for religiously needing to be independent and not being able to live under the Romans. And so our history preceded us. We were in the minority. And so in order to make to get to a governing scenario, essentially the Persians had to come to an agreement with the Christians. And hence, the Jews were thrown out once again from Jerusalem because essentially the Persians said, look, you know what, this is a power game, and we're just interested in who's got the most power. This reminded me, by the way, of a talk by Mark Stein. It must have been 15 years ago that I went to him. He wrote this book, America Alone, and you can see it's got this little seal of approval, soon to be banned in Canada. But the argument of America Alone is that, and back then, the birth rate in Europe was below replacement, and it's just recently I think I heard some news reports within the past 2 weeks about how the birth rate in the United States and Canada has also dropped below replacement, which means in order to keep your economy thriving, you need immigrants. Immigrants come from the third world, and in the case of Europe, all the immigrants who came from third world countries were more or less Muslims, and this is sort of continuing today. And this is why you have lots of Jews who are leaving France. But Mark Stein's point is this. He says, if you want to know who wins the battle, ask yourself who has the most 15-year-olds, because they have the demographic reality on their side. And so this story of the Persians and our loss of Jerusalem in the year 617, that is exactly this lesson. It's the lesson of, oh, you know what? You guys didn't have enough people. And because we were only 10 to 15% of the population, we did not win this scenario. Okay. Now, there's a very important moment that's about to drop here. You ready? Okay, the Persians were the last rulers of Israel without a religious vision until the British Mandate of 1920. The Persians didn't care what religion you were. They were agnostic. They wanted your money, not your soul. But every other ruler of Jerusalem and of Israel for the next essentially let's say, we'll call it 1,300 years, is going to want a piece of the religious action. So this also means, with the Persians, the Jews could have political aspirations to rebuild their temple, right? For that brief period of time. And remember, I told you this individual, we'll go back to him, Nehemiah ben Husiel. Nehemiah ben Husiel thought the reason he was restoring the karbanot, the sacrifices, because he thought, guess what? We're going to have a new temple. And Jews could think that that's what they were rebuilding. But guess what? Now that the Persians are gone, everybody else who's going to come in hereafter is going to have a religious vision. And not only that, they're going to have a religious vision for the exact same dunams of land that we call the Temple Mount, right? And so under the Arabs and the Christians, Jews no longer had any political hopes of independence, right? We were in pure survival mode under the Christians and the Muslims. In 629, the Roman Emperor Heraclius defends the Persians, and Jerusalem is once again under Christian control. So really, you have maybe 25 years of Persian control, and even under the Persians, we didn't have it wonderfully. Even the Persians kicked us out of Jerusalem because they understood that the population was largely Christian. And now the Christians demand retribution for persecution and the destroyed churches, right? Many of the Jews are put on trial. Jews are banished from Jerusalem and even from a 3-mile radius around the city. Jews are prohibited from praying and reciting the Shema, and they're only allowed to recite their own poetry. And this is the age in which piyutim are born. And we get maybe the greatest Jewish poet of maybe ever, but certainly of his era, and he's seen as the inspiration for many other poets in the future. This is Rabbi Eliezer Hakalir. And so if you look at, for example, the Tisha B'Av prayers, there are many things of Kalirs. If you look at the Machzor for Rosh Hashanah, Kalir is very, very dominant. He writes many of the prayers. And one of the things I was able to find, a really interesting study, is a professor in Israel who essentially went to the Cairo Geniza and unearthed fragments of Sidurim and collections of Kalir's poetry. And what he was able to do was for a long time, we didn't know exactly when Kalir lived. We knew he lived after the Talmud and probably somewhere around this period. Guesses were between the 5th and the 8th century. But what was found is a Tisha B'Av prayer of Kalir's, which references it has a historical description of the attack of the wild boar, or at least the Persians, on Jerusalem. And what much of Kalir's poetry for Tisha B'Av is about is a political sort of, not necessarily political, a sense invoking God's justice to get rid of Edom, the kingdom of Christianity of Rome. In Jewish literature, Edom refers to Rome, and it's associated with Esav. The little piece of his poetry that I have here for you just shows you an example of what he wrote. Be'eser makot lahachidam, with 10 lashes you should arrest them. Be'eser afelot lahamidam, with 10 types of darkness you should cause them to stumble. Be'eser mi'idot lahamidam, with 10 stumbling blocks you should make them stumble. Be'eser zvaot laharidam, with 10 earthquakes you shall cause them to tremble. Be'eser hafichot lahashmidam, with 10 overturnings you should destroy them. Be'eser sreifot lahaflidam, 10 burnings, you should scald them, etc., etc. So you see that's just an example. Hakalir is very, very poetic. He has a master of the Hebrew language, and his poetry often surrounds Tisha B'Av. In the very same article, it shows how many of his compositions, which were written for those of you who are sort of attuned to the Siddur, on Tisha B'Av there were special prayers that would be added to the 14th blessing of the repetition of the Shemona Esrei. The 14th blessing is the blessing of rebuilding Jerusalem. So you can see how he very clearly felt the loss of Jerusalem, the loss of hope for Jerusalem, the loss of hope for political independence in Jerusalem. And this is a very technical piece, but it sort of shows you the way in which his prayers understand the world and understand what we are praying for. There's something in the prayer which is called the siluk. The siluk, it means the transition, and it's what will transition you from this prayer, which is sort of add-on material, back to the regular prayers. So you're repeating the Shemona Esrei. It's the same Shemona Esrei you repeat, for 310 days of the year, or so. And in the middle of that prayer, there's a prayer you always say for rebuilding Jerusalem. But on this day, Tisha B'Av, before you return to the next blessing, or maybe in the middle of that blessing, before you get to the conclusion of it, there is a poem, and the poem has a final line. And the final line of the poem are these words: V'yachon olam al milato, prepare the world for its fulfillment. That, what are we praying for? We're praying for the fact that God needs to give us the political reality, the changes to be able to return to Jerusalem. And when we return to Jerusalem, the world will be fulfilled. All of the problems of the world will fall back into alignment. That's how Hakalir sort of is expressing this. It is hard to put all of the beautiful poetry of Hakalir into a 30-minute conversation, and especially since it's very subtle and intricate Hebrew, it's very hard to put that in front of us. But you should know that this is one of the great Jewish poets. If you could say he's the Chaucer or the Shakespeare, because he's so early in Hebrew poetry. There is one poet who did precede him by about 100 years, and that is the poet named Yanai. And Yanai is famous because Yanai may have been the author of the famous Unasana Tokef prayer, or maybe an early version of the Unasana Tokef prayer. And so that's another Paitan, another poet. But what's interesting is that no matter how oppressed the Jews were at this time, they had great poetry. And part of the reason that poetry flourished was because the Christians weren't allowing the Jews to pray the regular prayers. So it generated this special group of talented people who were composing new prayers. But alas, if 629 was when the Christians took over, like I told you, what had happened in the 400 years between the Persians and the Muslims was they beat each other up so sufficiently that they were both weakened. And so in 634, the Muslims invade. Between 636 and 637, they siege Jerusalem. And then there's an interesting legend that surrounds this. The legend is that the Roman Emperor Heraclius was told that a circumcised nation will fall upon you and undo you. So he always thought that it was the Jews, right? And he even had all of his Jews forcibly converted, maybe even in other parts of the empire. But the joke was on him, because Muslims are also circumcised. And so it wasn't the Jews that was his undoing, it was the Muslims. When the Muslims come in, they almost don't discriminate between Jews and Christians. They massacred them both. Both of them were sort of held in the same status. So this is the age where the crescent rather, eclipses the cross. And for a brief moment, Jews were once again allowed to move to Jerusalem when Omar ibn el-Khattab enters Jerusalem and gives the Jews permission to return. But alas, again, Omar quickly backtracked because once again the Christians are the majority. So even emperors negotiate with their subjects, and I hate to draw this parallel, but this is not completely unlike the fact that the British governing Israel during the mandatory period are afraid of Arab violence, and so they prevent Jews who are desperately in need of a homeland from leaving Nazi-occupied lands and entering Israel. The same thing is essentially happening here, right? The Muslims are come in, the Christians are making noise, they become unruly, and their complaints about the Jews sort of perpetuate the scenario where the Jews are barred from entering the city of Jerusalem. And so as we end this episode, more or less towards the middle of the 7th century, we once again come to a scenario where Jews are sort of left outside of their city of greatest importance. And so we're a reminder, by the way, these are the first Muslims to enter Jerusalem with any kind of force, with any kind of governing aspirations. We don't yet have a Dome of the Rock. We don't have an Al-Aqsa Mosque. None of that yet exists. We are just talking about the first time that the Arab armies came into Jerusalem. This is, by the way, the era where the caliphate is expanding itself throughout the Middle East, both East and West. It will be 70 or so years when Tariq will invade Spain and will spread Islam through Spain. That event, by the way, is not going to be something which is not without its repercussions. The Arab conquest of Spain and Israel is going to play very similarly to Christians. The Christians are going to fight wars to take back Spain. Christians are going to fight wars to take back Israel, and there are many, many, many similarities. So while this is a focus on Jerusalem, I think it's worth it for us to see how these particular episodes have threads that touch throughout the rest of the Jewish world. The other thing that I'm hoping to show, and for everybody who sees this, is the idea that this is the ancestral land of the Jewish people, and that there have been invaders and conquerors that have come in and displaced us for literally thousands of years. It's something that we need to know, and we need to be able to articulate, if you will, the chain of displaced provenance that has gone on sort of century after century. So at this point, the goal is to do it in 30 minutes. I did it in 35 minutes and 30 seconds, but I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Rabbi, the poet you spoke of, Hakalir,
Yes.
and the way you wrote it, does Kalir mean something in Hebrew? Because ha means the.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Hakalir means. I will have to. I can look. Can do a quick check.
Maybe it's acronym initials.
Yeah, but I'll take a quick look, see if there's any definition for Hakalir. where his name comes from.
Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
what language were the Christians speaking in Jerusalem?
Probably they were Roman subjects. So I'm gonna guess Latin. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the histories are written in Latin. There may have been some held over Greek as well, but I'm not 100% sure. I will have to. You should know that I'm not really an expert on this period. I just try and read enough to be able to string this together. So, I will try and get the answer to that, because that's a very good question.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
Yes.
you know, I mean, I throughout your classes and knowing history, I cannot help but all the time wonder why were we massacred so much and suffer so much, and then I compare it to the Muslims, and I said, couldn't we have missed the boat completely and been more like the Muslims in the spreading of Yiddishkeit than just being the victim?
Linda, that's an excellent point. The Jewish kings are instructed not to have too many horses. They're instructed not to have too large an army. And Islam has a concept called Dar al-Harab, Dar al-Islam, the house of war and the house of Islam, which means that they spread through conquest. And we are specifically, Jewishly, we are prohibited from doing this. And so there's a very good essential reason for that. It seems to me that if you ask me sort of why does this work in a Jewish sense, God wants us to be an example, not an overlord. And that's how Judaism is built. So you could ask, why are if we are the oldest people, Barbara Tuchman, I quote this a lot because I think it's very interesting. She wrote that of all the ancient peoples, the only one who live on the same land, worship the same religion, and speak the same language are the Jews. But if that's true, why are we so small? Like, if you just use a natural growth trajectory, there are 1 billion Muslims, there are 1 billion Catholics. What happened to us, right? We should be in the B's, not in the M's, right? We're 14 million and shrinking in the diaspora. So I think that the answer is that we didn't do what the Christians did, which was to convert people, and we didn't do what the Muslims did, which was conquer people. So I think that's the answer.
Rabbi, it's Arthur Dodick. I have a question, if you're finished with your point, and that is clarification of you indicated that from 617 till the British Mandate in 1920, there was no subjugation of the Jews.
No, that's what I said. I said there was the Persians were the last rulers who did not have a religious axe to grind. So that whether it was Christian or Muslim, they had a religious intent. And so the Jews couldn't have hopes to rebuild their temple under any of those scenarios. The Persians didn't police religion. They didn't have a religious horse in the game. They were, I guess, polytheistic, or they let people, their modus operandi was let people do whatever religion they wanted. So it could be that I miscommunicated, but the idea is that the Christians were the Christians and the Muslims didn't provide the same opportunity, and there was that 1300-year period where only Jews where Jews had to give up their former political aspirations. Does that clarify it, Arthur?
Yes, you did. Thanks. And what about when the British Mandate from after World War I wasn't there more a political influence rather than a religious influence?
So yes, I mean that was certainly the age of political Zionism. Although there were religious Zionists at the time, there's a famous attempt, or at least a famous suggestion, in the 19th century of Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, who was interested in restoring the sacrificial order. He wanted to start with the Passover offering. That was roundly rejected by the religious community, and probably there was no interest in the secular community. But there was, and that just shows you that as we sort of get towards the end of the Ottoman era and the beginning of the British era, there are a small number of people interested in that. But you're correct that during the early Yishuv, it was very, most of the organization was secular, and you have Jews like Brenner who want the Jew to be to shed off his weak personality. You have Bialik, the poet laureate of the Jews, who writes The City of Slaughter, who's sort of disgusted with sort of these weak religious Jews. They have a very new vision, a very different kind of Zionism and vision of what the Jews are meant to be. And so they're not particularly interested in going back to a very, very old model of the temple. But if we sort of think about it as in maybe slightly different sense, which is, are we interested in building a synagogue at the Kotel? Then nobody thought that no Jew thought they could build a synagogue at the Kotel between 629 and 1920. Then maybe or maybe let's go to maybe 1850. But until that time, that was a sort of a blackout period where we just didn't even hope for it. You would need to have a complete upheaval of the entire political, social structure of the world in order to get that.
Thank you so much for the clarity of your answer. And also, I really appreciate the time and the research that you must.
Well, thank you. I definitely have to prepare more for this than I think anything else that I
know. Thank you.
I have a question.
Okay, so Annie, just 1 second. I just did a quick search. The Byzantine Empire, they spoke mostly Roman. Latin was the official language, but there was some holdover Greek from people who had lived there. The Greeks who had developed the country over maybe the previous 500 years. So there was still much Greek that was also spoken. Yeah, Annie.
Regarding what you said about what commanded the kings, our kings are commanded not to have too many horses, not too many wives, and not too large an army. So this brings to mind King David and King Solomon when they in their conquest, number one, and number two.
Okay, so number one and number two.
And number two, the IDF today, without the army that we have, I don't think we have any chance of surviving there.
Okay, so the question is always, what is too many, right? So I would say that Gamal Abdel Nasser would say the Jews need such a big army because they want to conquer Egypt, right? That sounds like a very Nasser kind of statement, right? So we would say we have the army that's just large enough. We can have a whole discussion about about Israel and its need to have nuclear power so that it would protect itself against the inevitable, well, not the inevitable, but the formidable or the credible threat of Arab armies, and but Israel is not trying to take over Lebanon. It's not trying to take over Jordan. I know there are some people who say "Shtei gadot layarden, zu shelanu zu gam ken," right?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
which means there are two banks of the Jordan. This one's ours, and so is the other. There are people like that because but generally speaking, the Jewish population is happy with the current borders of the state of Israel, and we're not looking at an expansive army. The army is a purely defensive instrument of the state of Israel. in terms of Solomon, so the Talmud takes Solomon to task for his having too many wives, and less so for too large an army, but mostly for too many wives. And the Talmud will tell us that if you look in chapter 11 of the book of Kings, it says that Solomon worshipped idols. So the Talmud says he didn't really worship idols. How could Solomon worship idols? But what happened? Solomon had too many wives. And Solomon built a beautiful temple and many structures in the city of Jerusalem, one of which was a house for Pharaoh's daughter, which contained within it idol worship. Right? And so the Talmud sees Solomon's downfall as a product of the fact that he had too many wives, and the fact that the kingdom is split may have been a product of that very, very crime, that he had too many wives. And the Malbim has a very interesting read. Hold on, Meir, just 1 second. So the Malbim has a very interesting read of the Song of Songs. That part of it is Solomon's regret for having let the situation get out of hand. So there's it's a very interesting subject, but not one you identified it correctly. It's just that our tradition is critical about that piece, which would be a cautionary tale to any future king against saying, you know what, we need to spread Judaism. Let's conquer Lebanon. Yes, Meir.
So are we also critical of King David then? About his conquests?
So we are critical of David, but not for having too many wives. The Talmud sort of thinks that and it's hard to go back in history and judge people by our own standards. David had 18 wives, and that the Talmud sort of understands that's the max. Shouldn't go beyond that. Just for reference sake, anybody know? Well, I know Ralph knows. How many wives did David have? I'm sorry, Solomon have?
1,000.
Once you put together the concubines and the wives, you get close to 1,000. So yeah. Yes, Meir.
So what I don't understand, we're saying that Shlomo Melech had a house where they were worshiping idols specifically?
Well, I think if I was technically being correct, Shlomo HaMelech had a wife who had a house where they were worshiping idols.
So because he was married to her, supposedly, that meant that he also worshipped idols?
Let me ask you a question, Meir. If I'm not saying this happens, Chalila, but if my wife went to Mass on Sunday, would I still be the rabbi of Sharat Tzedek?
Not for long.
I think it would just be hard to sort of negotiate that balance, right?
You wouldn't be the married rabbi of Sharat Tzedek.
So there you go. I just so you have I put that in context. I know you want to defend Shlomo, and I appreciate the passion, but you can understand why that could be a little problematic.
Well, it's not that I want to defend Shlomo. He's been looked up by many high rabbinic figures as somebody of great historic and Jewish importance.
This is why the Hebrew Bible is a genius work, because there is not a single hero in the Hebrew Bible that does not have his weakness exposed and bared to all. Moshe hit the rock. Abraham goes down to Egypt when he should have stayed in Israel, right? You know, we could go down the list.
Yeah, but that's the difference between this and being somebody who worships idols, which is a
Mayor, I can't rewrite the Book of Kings. I might be a very talented rabbi, but I can't rewrite Sefer Malachim. It's written there.
Yes, but the rabbinic interpretation you told us is that because he didn't stop his wives, it was as if, but it's an as if. And I don't think Meir is missing that.
No, I think Meir doesn't like even my apologetic. Wait, Meir, Meir, you want me to say that Shlomo worshipped idols himself?
No, what I'm trying to understand is...
Why do all the rabbis venerate Shlomo? That's your question.
If he violates such a basic concept of the Ten Commandments, then how could he even be considered the hero by rabbis?
Because
he's violating a very important part of the Ten
so
Commandments.
I think that's why the rabbis cannot stomach the idea that's why they say that it must have been his wives, but it was such a big offense that the Tanakh attributes the guilt to him.
And the prophet says, "Hineni koreh et hamamlacha ma'alecha," that he's no longer fit.
Yeah.
I mean, it says so clearly. It says, "Lo haya shalem im Adonai kilvav shelvavo lo haya shalem kilvav David aviv."
Yep.
And it said that he.
Okay, so what Linda's quoting is the fact that the Navi there says that is because of this that the kingdom is ripped in two, and that's why you have Yehuda as one kingdom, the southern kingdom, and Ephraim or Yisrael as the northern kingdom. 10 tribes leave. Okay, so I thank everyone for tuning in, and I wish everybody a fantastic week.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I put in a comment of the origin. In chat, there's a comment on the origin of the word Hakalir.
Oh.
Okay.
I don't see it there, Ralph.
So anyway, Hakalir is supposed to come from the Greek word for small cake. And they used to give students at the beginning of their studies cakes decorated with Jewish sayings. And it's thought to be a reference to his full knowledge of Jewish lore.
Okay. Interesting.
Thank
All right.
you.
Fascinating lecture, Rabbi. Fascinating lecture. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very
Thank
much.
you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Happy
Happy
Hanukkah,
Thank you, Meir.
everybody.
Thank
You,
you, Rabbi.
Rabbi.